Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Stories from the Other Side of Midnight, Volume 3, Story 1. Touring the continent alone is great for me. I don't need to worry about itineraries, other people. I simply please myself. There's also not a great deal to fear. There's only one venomous snake, which is rare, and precious little else will hurt you apart from other humans. Down in the Ardèche region of France, I'd camped above a small river, once again in a mad dash at dusk as a storm set in. I woke up just around dawn to hear something wading up the river just below me. For some reason, my first thought was bear, which wouldn't usually be the first thought to pop into my head. Why? I have no idea. Whatever was walking upstream, it must have had some strength. The river had swollen slightly from the rain the previous evening, but it wasn't a raging torrent. The swooshing of the water was loud and the progress was steady, though definitely labored. I was too scared to lean out and lift a tarp to see what it was. When I did move in the hammock, the rip-stop nylon makes a bit of a racket, and the sounds stopped. I held my breath, and it resumed until it was out of earshot. It had to be a fisherman, I told myself, but upon getting out of the hammock, it was plain that no man would have been able to walk upstream in that riverbed with such apparent ease. Why bother fighting the river anyway? I was shaken, possibly because I was convinced it was a bear. Bears? In France? Mais non, c'est impossible. That same trip, I passed through the Pyrenees into Andorra and then Spain. On the French side, I spent a rather uncomfortable night in the middle of nowhere, fearfully listening to dogs howling like wolves from somewhere in the mountain above. They obviously weren't wolves. Were they? Well, when I got home, I found that some chap had a captive breeding program somewhere close to where I was in the Pyrenees with the aim of repopulating some of the places wolves were wiped out last century. Wild wolves have also crossed over from Spain and are now apparently doing well in several regions of rural France. I've heard dogs howling. I'm not familiar with wolf packs, but the howling the previous night chilled me like nothing that I'd heard before. Interestingly, a program to reintroduce the brown bear has also been tried in the Pyrenees, with about 20 bears surviving at the moment. That's quite away from the Ardèche and the river wading incident, though. The thing that piques my interest is that both times I woke up scared. I knew what was out there and lay still, holding my breath. I remained convinced I heard wolves and a bear. On other occasions, like when I woke to hear something in my vicinity and found that there were wild boar checking out my cooking pots, I wasn't scared, just aware that something was around, until something spooked the boar and it sounded like all hell had broken loose as they scattered. That made my heart beat a little faster. I wholly subscribe to the view that we have an innate sense which warns us of lurking predators and impending doom, even if we don't know what that doom is. Story number 2. This was back in 2013. I had something really weird happen to me one weekend. I think it was on a Saturday morning. My fiancée and I had a 17-month-old son together, and she had 3 boys, ages 7, 6, and 4 from a previous marriage. Also, my future sister-in-law and a niece, aged 6, were currently living with us. So the 3 boys went to their dad's house every weekend from Friday at 4 p.m. until Monday at 8 a.m. My niece was at her dad's house for the entire Father's Day weekend. My sister-in-law went to work at 6 a.m. and had to work at 12. So, back to really early Saturday morning. Our son is just getting to the point where I think he's getting afraid of the dark. So he wakes up occasionally through the night and will cry for about 2 or maybe 10 minutes and then pass back out. It happens more often than not. So we just kind of listen when we wake up, and if it goes on for too long, one of us goes and checks on him. Our bedroom is in the back room on the first floor. His bedroom is right next to ours towards the front of the house, with a connecting doorway to our bedroom and to the living room. Think circular floor plan, but a third of it is through bedrooms. Everyone else sleeps upstairs. So he woke up crying, and I know it's really early and he would just fall right back to sleep. But I kind of kept my ear out, so to speak. My fiance isn't moving or tossing and turning like she usually would, even though I'm half asleep. I know she's technically awake by her breathing. So I let him cry softly and see if he goes back to sleep and pass out, which he does for about another hour or two, when I got up to feed him and get ready to head to the oldest baseball's game. She wakes up about a half hour after I did. Later in the day, once we get back home, she has a weird look on her face and asks me if I got up to calm our son down this morning when he cried. I said no. I just let him fall back to sleep on his own. And she says, oh, okay, never mind. At this point, I know enough about my future wife to know that she heard something. Something I don't want to know about because it freaks the hell out of me. Not sure where exactly she would classify it, but when we were house hunting, she would tell me which houses had things left over in them. Call them ghost spirits, if you will. Her whole family has stories of mediums and such. Her great-grandmother was supposedly fairly gifted at it. We think her oldest has it too. He has nightmares in the old apartment of dogs barking in his room. No animals were around or allowed, but we smelled smoke downstairs every morning he had those nightmares. Well, after a look from me, she says, I think maybe her sister came down and comforted our son this morning before work because I heard someone talking to him and then he quieted down. They said, it's okay, go back to sleep, in a very soft, calming voice. At this point, I've got goosebumps all up and down my back. Someone called him by his name? Someone knew his name? It's one of two things that really gets my imaginative juices flowing, and that instinctual childhood fear kicked back up. I don't like ghosts, period. I love the thrill of being scared by it, but during the day, and especially not in my own home. Oh, hell no. So my sister-in-law gets home that night, and my wife asks her if she checked in on our son before going to work. Solid no. She asks why. So then she says that she heard someone talking to him and calming him down this morning. She also knows the family history and how this stuff isn't all that far-fetched for them, and says a very understanding, oh. My thinking is that if there's something or someone in our house right now, it might be my grandmother who passed away last October prior to this incident. She was the only person that our son knew, or knew our son for that matter, and that she had passed. We've had other occurrences happen at weird hours of the night. We actually sprinkled baby powder on the floor near our TV the first year we moved in because we heard footsteps over there all the time late at night. Nothing turned up, but we left it there for a few days. And my fiancée, she's heard things late at night, asks me if I heard it, and I say no, and she says, okay, never mind. Mind you, that she has 30% hearing loss in both ears. Our bedroom is directly below the older boys, and if one wakes up, I can hear which one it is by how they're walking, talking, whispering, when she won't know they're up until they are at our bedroom door. My fiancé's godmother, only a few years older than us, visited us 2 or 3 weeks after that. She has quite a bit stronger communication skills, and she knows and has seen 2 or 3 ghosts in her house. Her toddler daughter used to say her best friend was such and would play with them in her room. A name that she got out of one of the ghosts like 6 months later was Cincy. So a really old city with extremely old homes. Well, she came to visit. My sister-in-law was asking her all sorts of questions about this stuff, and she looked at her foot after talking about stuff that goes on in her house. Apparently, they step on her foot, and her foot gets warm, to let her know they're there, which is what she told us. She didn't get a bad feeling, but she knew one was around, or at least passing through. For any non-believers, I've heard enough stories from this family and witnessed enough weird things around them to know that in some form, ghosts or spirits exist living among us. Freaks me the hell out, but I believe in it. I think it all has to do with your perception and peace of mind on it. If you open yourself up, you will experience things that can solidly sway your mind. But if you close yourself off, you'll never witness what occurs. Next story. My story begins in the summer of 1975 when I struck up a friendship with a coworker at a summer job. We were both going to be seniors in high school in the fall, and we both had a lot in common. We became pretty close friends and did everything together that summer. We did some double dating, and he met his future wife that summer. He was engaged before he was out of high school and was married shortly after graduation. Children came quickly, and we lost touch as our lives took different paths. It's been about 7 years after that I had any contact with Jim. But on an icy cold January night, I woke in a hotel room from a disturbing dream, and I was drenched in sweat. In the dream, I saw my friend Jim. His face was backlit by what appeared to be white light, much like a full moon forming a halo of light around his face. His eyes were open wide, and the wind was rippling through his hair. The dream image seemed even stranger because we weren't face to face in the conventional sense. It was like we were both adrift or weightless. The image had the feel of both of us staring at each other, with one of us being inverted. I was excited to see him and yelled, "Jim, how have you been?" His expression never changed, and he seemed pale. He just kept calling me by my name and pleading, "I'm cold. I'm so cold." I awoke and couldn't shake the image. I finally drifted back off to sleep at about 3 a.m., but the dream came back. I went into work the next morning and was unable to shake the dream. I told the story to my co-workers, who found the story to be pretty eerie. It was Friday, and I traveled home from work that afternoon. That evening, I was stunned by the evening news that reported my friend had slid off an ice-packed country road on the way home at a bridge and had tragically died in the accident. I couldn't believe my ears. It gave me chills, and the dream was forever etched in my mind. Over the years, I thought about that dream. It seemed pretty creepy, but time has the ability to put some of those things in perspective. I let it go as crazy coincidence. About 8 years passed, and I was called out of my job to investigate a car accident on a Saturday night. A drunken driver had driven onto a railroad track way out in the middle of the country and had gotten hung up there. I was dispatched to ensure there was no damage to the track. While waiting for the car to be removed from the track, I sat with a local sheriff's deputy and chatted about my roots to that area as I grew up. It turned out the deputy had been a friend of my old buddy Jim, and we were only about a mile from where he had lost his life in the accident. In fact, he had been the one who found my friend the cold January night. I mentioned that I had heard he had slid off the road at a bridge and had died tragically in the accident. He corrected me and said, "That's not what happened." He said that Jim had headed home in his truck and slid off the road at a small bridge. The truck overturned in the ditch upside down just after dark on a lightly traveled road and became obscured by the brush. He told me he found my buddy around 3 a.m. The accident had not injured him. He was belted into his seat. Unfortunately, the accident broke all of his windows out and crushed the cab just enough that he couldn't get out of his inverted position. He was suspended upside down in the cab with no coat on for about 8 hours on a bitterly cold night. He told me when he found him, he was barely conscious. All he could do was mumble, "I'm so cold, I'm so cold." They extracted him alive out of the truck, but he died of hypothermia on the way to the hospital. That's when my blood ran cold. I have chills to this day when I think of that dream. Next story. This happened in the late 80s. I was about 20, 21, and 2 friends and I went camping in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at that time, so we were able to camp for free in other parks in the state. Both of us had done a lot of camping before. Me, I grew up camping with my family on every single vacation all over the state. For the other friends with us, this was her first camping trip ever. We were camping in the youth area, which was empty that weekend and was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. The first day we just relaxed at the campsite. Several of the rangers on duty stopped by to say hello, that sort of thing. We had 2 tents set up, a one-man pup tent that my co-worker brought and a larger dome tent we'd borrowed from someone. Unfortunately, the zipper of the dome tent had been damaged and couldn't be opened. All 3 of us had to squeeze into the smaller tent that first night. I swear it was like something out of the Three Stooges. All 3 of us squashed under one blanket, and if anyone wanted to turn onto their side, all of us had to sort of squirm in place onto our sides at the same time. We still managed to sleep pretty well. The second day, we wandered the established trails and chatted with whoever was on duty at the visitor center. Later in the afternoon, we all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite, being within shouting distance but enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then I'd kind of feel like someone was watching me, but it wasn't really uncomfortable. I'd look around, see and hear nothing, and then shrug it off and go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site about a quarter-mile away came over with a truckload of firewood and a six-pack of beer. We all sat around talking for a while. Well, after dark, we could suddenly hear what was probably a bunch of teenagers fooling around on one of the trails a couple of miles away. Since the trails were closed at sunset, the ranger and my co-worker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I got that feeling, that one that people describe as a cold chill. I felt it wash over me. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and out of nowhere, I was terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't say anything to my friend. I didn't want to scare her. Then I glanced over at her, just as she glanced at me. She said, "Do you feel that?" I said, "Yeah. I think maybe we'd better go to the car." We both felt like we were in deadly danger, but no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. Then halfway to the car, we looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in and locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. I sat there with my pistol, feeling like it was totally inadequate for whatever was out there. We both just sat looking straight ahead. We were afraid to look around. I had the feeling at one point that if I turned my head and looked out the window, I'd see something that would drive me insane. I don't know how long we sat there. It was probably just a few minutes, but it felt like forever. Then it just left. We could actually feel it pulling away. A few minutes after that, the other two came back in the truck. We kind of laughed it off, but I'll tell you, I've never been that scared before or since. I've faced a lot in my life, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced we were in terrible danger. Next story. I was in my early 20s and living on Oahu with my sister. We liked to go hiking, not on any established trails. We just picked a likely looking spot of woods and started exploring. One day we decided to explore part of the mountains a mile or two from our house. After wandering vaguely uphill through the woods for a couple of hours, we came upon 3 stone cairns. They were good size, maybe about 6-7 feet long, 5 feet wide at the base, 5 to 6 feet high, and they were old. They were covered with vines and leaf moss and just had that worn look that very old stone gets. We figured they were old burial cairns. We stood and looked at them for a few minutes. Then, without really knowing why, I put my hands together and bowed as a sign of respect. My sister did the same. Then we circled around them and kept hiking. Fast forward a few more hours. We were starting to reach an area that would have been too steep to go much further, and we realized that we had lost track of time and the sun was setting behind the mountains. Well, we were screwed little idiots. We had nothing with us, not even a flashlight. We started heading down as fast as we could, but the dark caught up to us. Just before the light went away completely, we started to hold hands so we wouldn't lose each other. Now, this was no place to be lost in the dark. We'd passed several crevices and cliffs that would kill you if you fell off, and it was literally so dark in those woods that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. We were scared for sure and didn't know what to do. Then suddenly my sister starts walking and leading me down the mountain. I figure her eyes had adjusted and she could somehow see better than I could, so I just trusted her and let her lead. Her pace never faltered. She kept walking steadily and ended up leading us out of the woods exactly where we'd gone in. I let out a big sigh and told her I was so glad she was able to see enough to get us down. Then she turned to me and her face was white. She said, "I couldn't see a thing. Someone else took my other hand and started leading me. I was so scared I just closed my eyes and followed." She said whatever took her hand had let go just as we stepped out of the woods. We never went back to that spot. My sister still doesn't like to talk about it. I left the islands more than 20 years ago, but I'd like to find that place again someday just to say thank you. Next story. My brother Chad is quite the outdoorsman and enjoys all aspects of hunting and fishing. One day he's down at the beach doing a little beach fishing. I don't remember what he was fishing for, or with what, but he said he wasn't having much success that day. He was in about chest deep water and casting out, doing his thing. Well, he said there was this little kid that had on all matching yellow goggles, snorkel, and fins. He said this kid kept getting around him and he was afraid that he was going to snag him with his hook, so he told the kid to stay clear. Well, some time goes by and he's still fishing when all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he sees something yellow. Well, he thinks it's this kid again and gets mad. He started reeling in his bait, preparing to give the kid the business. For some reason, turns back towards shore, which is about 20 or 30 yards away, and sees the kid getting out of the water. At this point, the fear sets in. He turns back to look at the yellow object that caught his eye and sees a massive fin come out of the water. I remember him vividly telling me it looked like the back end of a horse, it was so big. He froze in terror as his massive shark came right at him, goes right by and then submerges down into the water, following the shoreline. About 40 feet away from him is this big muscular dude in the water, talking with his girl who was on a float next to him. Chad said the shark was headed straight for them. He looked at both of them and screamed, "Shark!" He said the dude got mad because he thought Chad was messing with him and his girl. About that time, Chad points down into the water when the shark's fin comes out of the water towards them. He said the dude's eyes got real big and he picked up the girl and threw her towards the shore and then took off swimming for the beach. He said he threw her a good ways too. My brother, being still bugged out somewhat at this point, turns to see a helicopter coming straight over him, screaming for all swimmers to get out of the water immediately. He said it resembled a much smaller version of the Jaws scene where people are scrambling to get out of the water as fast as possible. I can't remember if he said they got the shark or not, but he remembers it was a monster hammerhead, and he said he didn't do any more fishing that day or since, standing in chest-deep water. Next story. This didn't happen to me, but to a friend of mine. It's important to note he's a paramedic. Anyway, he was out in British Columbia, camping in the Rockies, and one night he goes into town to go clubbing, had a good time, decided it was time to go back to his trailer. As he's driving through the mountain, he reaches a very secluded area. No lights, no people around for kilometers, nothing. He sees a car pulled over to the side of the road and two people lying in the middle of the road. He thought this was odd. Why would the car be pulled over? And the passengers are out of it and about 3 meters away in the middle of the road. Being a paramedic, he decided he had to stop and help them. But as he approached, he said he just got a very bad feeling. So he decided to go around them and park in front of them, just in case he needed to drive away quickly. As he passed them, he looked back in his rearview mirror and sees them sitting up looking at him. Then he says he sees two more people come creeping out of the bushes from the side of the road. He immediately realized that he had to get out of there and fast. He drove away and got away safely. The next day he spoke to locals and found out that from time to time people will fake accidents out in the mountains where you're isolated and they rob you blind, maybe kill you, leave you tied up or something. He says if he hadn't gotten that feeling that something didn't quite add up, he thinks he'd be dead today. Next story. A little background. I grew up on a large farm, hunting, trapping, etc. I've camped most of my life, so the woods don't scare me. But this one time, something happened back in the 80s in the mountain country along the North Carolina-South Carolina border when I was a deputy. Around 3 a.m., a lady who lived alone way the heck out in the back of nowhere called in a prowler complaint. When I arrived, she met me at the door and was obviously very agitated, which is unusual for most mountain folks. They're usually very self-reliant and calm. She lived in a mobile home set on a small cleared lot, with a tree line approximately 25 meters to the rear, leading into a thickly wooded area. "Officer," she said, "you're going to think I'm crazy, but a bear or something is in the woods behind my house. I've been hearing something big moving around in those woods for almost an hour before I finally got scared enough to call for help." Not an unusual call for service. People call all the time because they're always hearing strange sounds. So I canceled backup and asked her to go back inside, lock the door, and wait for me while I checked it out. As I said, no biggie, just a routine suspicious noise call, until I walked behind the trailer towards the woods. The term One's blood running cold comes close to describing the feeling that suddenly came over me as I froze in my footsteps. No noises from anything moving in the trees, but I could feel something evil in there watching me. This is silly, I thought. I'm a grown man for crying out loud, a policeman armed and trained to deal with danger. But in my heart of hearts, I knew that there was something not human in there, something waiting for me to come closer, just as I knew in my heart that I would die if I entered those woods. Drug busts, car chases, bank robberies, yeah. I've had a tense moment or two on the job, but I've never felt that type of fear before or since. I knew without any doubt that if I went into those woods, then I would never come out alive. How do you request backup for something like that, I wondered. So I did what I thought was a smart thing under the circumstances. I convinced the lady to grab some clothes, and I followed her as she drove to her mom's for the night. Did I chicken out? Oh yeah, big time. But I'm alive, and I don't believe for a second that I would be if I had ventured into those woods at night. Next story. One weekend I was camping with 3 friends in northern Arizona. I used to live south of Sedona. It was late February or early March, and we decided to go up into the mountains where there was still some snow. We found us a great spot about 3 miles from where we parked the truck. It was a smallish area under some pines, and the ground was mostly clear of snow, under the trees, yet still a little damp. There was still a good 6 to 8 inches of snow on the ground around us. Well, we pitched the 2 tents and got camp set up. After eating and sitting around the fire BSing for a while, we rolled into the bags and we went to sleep. I'd been asleep for about 2 hours, so when something woke me up, I was a light sleeper, so it doesn't take much. So at first I ignored it and tried to go back to sleep, but to no avail. It was just a creepy feeling that told me something wasn't right. As I lay there, eyes closed, I thought I heard something walking towards the camp. I've been in the woods all my life, and I know the sound difference between a bipedal creature and a quadruped, and this was definitely walking on 2 legs. I grabbed my pistol and light and was about to get up when something in the back of my brain told me to stay still. So I listened and didn't make a move or sound. The steps were growing louder, and then something on 2 legs passed between the tent and the fire. There was a shadow that passed over the tent, but it wasn't as deep of a shadow as it should have been, if that makes sense. Well, I kept laying there and listened to the footsteps recede. Finally, about an hour later, I drifted back to sleep and didn't awaken any more that night. The next morning, I got out of the tent and started looking around the campsite for footprints that didn't belong to us. Like I said earlier, the ground was still damp, and there should have been prints that a blind man could have followed. Nothing. So I started to widen my circle to include the snow that was approximately 20 feet from the fire. Still nothing other than our prints. We had come in from the south, and the sound traveled east to west. I told the rest of the guys about it, and 2 of them just blew it off. But the other friend knew me well enough to know that I wasn't going to say something unless I was 100% sure it wasn't a dream. The next night, we went to bed, and it was about the same time of night that I was awakened again by a strange feeling. The guy in the tent with me was one of the doubters from the previous day, so when I got that feeling, I woke him up as well. Sure enough, pretty soon, we heard the footsteps. They got closer and closer, and then the figure passed between the fire and us. I looked over at him, and his eyes were wide as saucers. I fell back to sleep about an hour later again, and I'm not sure if the other guy ever went back to sleep. The next morning, we all searched for footprints for at least 2 hours, ranging out in the direction that whatever it was had traveled, and we still found nothing more than a rabbit about a half-mile from the camp. Definitely not our critter. I'm pretty sure that I know now what it was. It had to be some type of spirit. I know there are several different Native American tribes that are from the area, and we weren't too far away from the Navajo Nation. I believe it was some native spirit out wandering around, traveling that path that he or she did every night. Then I had another incident while I was living in Arizona. I was living in the small town of Jerome, and I was helping with the remodeling of an old mining hospital. The people that bought it decided to turn it into a swanky hotel. They did a hell of a job on it for sure. One night, we all decided to get together and cook and drink and relax. This was about a year before the completion. I think it took 2.5 years total to complete. Well, I had to go out of town for the weekend and was leaving early, so I only had 2 beers with dinner and was by far the soberest one in the bunch. Now, everyone in the town knew that the hospital had a reputation of being haunted, but I never gave much credence to the stories. I thought they were just cool stories. So about 11 or so, one of the owners asked if I would accompany him to the penthouse to see where they were going to build the residence. I agreed and followed him to the third-floor landing. As we started up the steps to the fourth floor, the penthouse, I started to get this strange feeling, something that I had never had before. As I went up the steps, it continued to worsen. It felt like each step I took, there was something pushing back on me. I started to get a little scared at that point. By the time I reached the landing between the flights, I was completely freaked out and couldn't breathe. Let me clarify that I'm a pretty level-headed guy and have been through some shit in my life, including my stint in the army as a scout. But this was the most scared I've ever been in my life. I told the owner that I couldn't go any further and that I would see it later. Yeah, right. As I went back down the stairs, the feeling slowly went away. And by the time I got to the third-floor landing, I was fine. That was definitely something up there, though, that did not want me in its domain. The next week, I was talking to one of the locals and asked him about the hospital and the top floor in particular. Apparently, that used to be the morgue, and back in the 60s or 70s, one of the caretakers that had been living there died in a mysterious fire on the top floor along with his wife. Supposedly, no one knew what started the fire, but there was very little left of the bodies when they got the fire out. Still haven't been to the top floor, even though I have been back to the hotel several times.